Hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope your week has been healthy and filled with bracha, hopefully simcha as well. I want to begin the shiur by acknowledging that tonight's shiur is generally sponsored by Marika Weiss, and the sponsorship is in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Marika's late husband, Chaim Weiss, Zichrono Libracha. Marika, may Chaim's neshama have an aliyah, and may you and your whole family, wherever they are, blessed with
Thank you.
a long life and good health. Um,
Thank you.
again, we hope it's on. I've already recorded it. You didn't notice, Selma. I started the recording even on my own, and Jonathan didn't remind me, and I did it before anybody did. So proud of myself.
Very proud
Um,
of you, Rabbi Diamond.
thank you, everybody. Um, again, we heard that there's going to be a truce tomorrow morning, starting at 10 a.m. Israeli local time with Lebanon. Yehi Ratzon, may be Hashem's will that this truce be one to bring shalom in the short term, in the long term, and may all of our efforts go to bringing back messages. I'm going to mute everybody just so that there's no background noise and that we have a chance to listen and learn. Okay, the beginning Parsha told us. These Parshat, as you know, are so dramatic. They're so inspiring. They're so human. And the stories, I think, touch on so many themes that are not just themes about our avot and imahot, as you know, but as I constantly said, they're themes that are parts of our lives. Because they are so human, these stories, we have an opportunity to relate to them on many different levels. And so the beginnings Parsha tells us about the struggle of a husband and a wife who love each other, but are unable to fulfill their dreams of becoming parents. Um, Rivka remains barren for 20 years. According to some, she thought of herself by that point as being incapable of conceiving. She thought that she was biologically incapable, not just that Hashem didn't want it, but she thought there's something wrong with her. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Yosef Nehemiah Karnitzer was I think, the last Rav in Krakow in Poland before the war. And he has a Perush on Chumash, and the Torah describes in the beginning of Parshat Toldot, which is chapter 25, that she becomes pregnant, and the Torah tells us that she's experiencing something that she never experienced before. It says the children agitated within her, and she said, "If so, why am I thus?" According to Rashi and other Meforshim, she was wondering about the nature of the pregnancy that she was experiencing. Torah says, "Vayitrotzetsu habanim," that the boys, the children, the embryos inside her were causing such distress. Rabbi Kernitzer suggests that, unlike Rashi, who suggests that she's aware that she's pregnant and she's seeking to daven and get counsel as to how to manage this struggle, Rabbi Kornitzer in his paper says she didn't know she was pregnant. She didn't even think she could get pregnant. After 20 years of not being pregnant, she had lost any hope of becoming pregnant. And when she was feeling what she was feeling, she didn't attribute it to pregnancy. She didn't attribute it to anything going on. What she did attribute it to was illness. She thought she was having some GI problem, and that's the only thing that she could possibly attribute it to, because she had long stopped imagining herself as a mother or the potential to become a mother. And so when this experience overwhelmed her, she wasn't asking, what should I do with the kids? Like, why is this happening to a pregnant woman? She was asking, Lama ze anochi? Like, what's going on? Where nothing to do with pregnancy. Rabbi Kerniger says that's why she went to ask advice. And it was when she went to speak to whoever she spoke to, that's the point that she was informed, you're actually pregnant, which she didn't possibly know. But she goes through a lot before she can become a mother. And so let's just take a look at that verse again, which describes this experience. So the Torah tells us, Vayitrotzetsu abanim bikirba. I'm reading now chapter 25, verse 22. Vayitrotzetsu habanim bikirba, vatomer im kein lama ze anochi. Vatelech lidrosh et Hashem. Children agitated within her, and she said, if so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of Hashem. She went to inquire of Hashem. So what does that actually mean? She went somewhere to inquire of Hashem. So the Ramban has opinion, well, she didn't go anywhere, meaning she's not actually physically relocating herself. She's not going on a trip. She's not going on a journey. This phrase, to go lidrosh, is a phrase used elsewhere in Tanakh, but to seek Hashem's counsel. How? Through prayer. You don't have to go anywhere to daven. You can daven in your home. So that's in fact what the Ramban says. Rashi, before the Ramban, has a different explanation. I'm just going to share the Rashi with you. Vatelech lidrosh. So Rashi believes that she actually went somewhere. She packed up a bag and she left home and she went somewhere. Where did she go? The Beit Midrash shel Shem. She went to the Beit Midrash of Shem. Shem, of course, Shem, Cham, and Yafet, the three sons of Noah. So after the flood was over, Shem became, as it were, a spiritual leader of the generation. He, like his father, but everybody that generation, underwent a tremendous traumatic event, but it also helped him gain a tremendous understanding of God. And he became, as it were, a spiritual leader, and his reputation had spread. And so when Rivka was going through this extraordinary upheaval and didn't understand what was going on, whether it's Yosef Kornitzer's explanation, she didn't know she's pregnant, or she did know she was pregnant, but she realized that this experience was unusual. Even for somebody who never was a mother, she had this awareness that there's something just beyond what she had seen in other pregnant ladies. And so she needed to ask a question like, why is this happening? What's the meaning behind this? What am I supposed to derive from this? Which, by the way, raises an interesting point. If, as we suggest, and I've said this lots and lots of times before, there really aren't any coincidences, meaning that the things that happen to us in our lives are not happenstance, that they're very deliberate. There's meaning behind everything that happens to us, the joys that we experience, the bracha that we experience, and the challenge. So if that's your starting point, that things happen to you for a reason, maybe Hashem wants you to learn something as a result of some experience or some series of experiences. So when things happen that are really, really tough in our lives, and God knows, all of you know as well, that stuff like that does happen. So the question that gets asked is, so why? Why is this happening? What, Hashem, what do you want me to learn from this? So that's a pretty deep question. And it's not always an answer. An answer doesn't always immediately emerge. But the point coming from this story that I wanted to just say in this one sentence is that the things that happen to us are not without meaning. And sometimes we have to pause, sit down, and think this through. Sometimes we need to ask advice on it. I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So she does need to seek advice. And so she goes to whom she believes is the spiritual leader of that generation, Shem. We'll come back to that in a second. And so she actually physically goes to where he is, Lidrashet Hashem, to ask this person, in this case, Shem, Shiagidla Matehe Besofa. She wants to ask Shem, what's going to happen? Because something is going on and she doesn't know exactly what the meaning is. So that's Rashi. Rashi is suggesting that she's going to Shem. So let's just pause for 1 second and ask what ought to be, I think, an obvious question. So according to Rashi's understanding, not the Ramban, Ramban means she went to daven. She davened. She was having this personal communion, as it were, with Hashem, davening to Hashem, asking Hashem this question, please somehow bring understanding to me, answer this, why is it happening? Rashi says she's going to the Beit Midrash of Shem. But if Rashi's explanation is correct, that she's going to the Beit Midrash of Shem, I'm not chas v'shalom saying that Rashi is wrong. But according to Rashi's thinking, you have to ask yourself, well, why is she going to Shem? She's married to Yitzchak. Yitzchak was an Ola Tamima. Yitzchak was the one who was on Har Moriah. Yitzchak is the one who was about to be sacrificed by Abraham. Doesn't her own husband rate as a man of spiritual strength? Why doesn't she turn to him and ask him that question? Or if for whatever reason Rivka wasn't prepared to or comfortable with asking her husband, What about her father-in-law, Avraham Avinu, who was still alive? Like certainly Avraham would have been a person who one would have thought would be able to answer questions of purpose in life and meaning in life. That seems to be what she's looking for. After all, that was the words in the pasuk. Lama zeh nochi. So what am I? What's this? If this is happening to me, why am I thus? That's a pretty significant question. That's an existential question. So Abraham's not capable of answering existential questions. That was his whole life, starting when he was a little boy and moved through all the experiences of asking those questions. But according to Rashi, she didn't go to either one of those two, neither her husband nor her father-in-law. I want to share an explanation from Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, otherwise known as the Netziv, an acronym. He was the last Rosh Yeshiva of the famous Volozhin Yeshiva in Lithuania. So I just want to suggest or share with you his opinion about something. So Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin suggests that yes, she did go somewhere. She absolutely did, not like Ramban, not about davening, more in line with Rashi, definitely more in line with Rashi. And the Netziv makes the following statement, and he says that there are two kinds of Nevi'im. There are two categories of people who Hashem reveals himself to, who Hashem, as it were, shares divine messages with. Two types. Now, what the definition, by the way, of a Navi, of a prophet, is a person to whom Hashem communicates in some way. Everybody can talk to Hashem. That all of us can. We all have the opportunity to speak to Hashem. But in the sense that Hashem speaks to us in some sort of direct method of communication, that's different. But when Hashem does use a method of communication with a human being, that person is designated as a Navi, as a prophet. So the Netziv says there's two categories of Nevi'im. One, Echad Mehashem Mashim Medaber Imo L'Sha'ah. This is a Navi who Hashem speaks to for a specific purpose, something that has to be explained or dealt with now. For the word L'Sha'ah, Sha'ah means an hour, for the present. So there are people to whom Hashem turns to, speaks to, engages with, communicates with, because there needs to be something done, or that person needs to know something because of circumstances which are unfolding now. And once those circumstances are over or dealt with in whatever manner, Hashem may never speak to that person again. That's category number one. But there's a second category. A person who is able to see things which are hidden from others. A person who has some sort of divine inspiration, Ruach HaKodesh, meaning it's not something that Hashem reveals to a person because some issue has come up and has to be dealt with. That's temporary. The second category is a person who has some divine inspiration which animates them, and this divine inspiration gives this person the ability to see things that others don't, to understand things that others don't, to sort of be aware of that which seems to be hidden to the eyes of other people. We all see things, but some of us have a deeper understanding and an insight that I don't have. Somebody can see things more clearly, more perceptively, more intuitively than me, but also more spiritually. And so that's the second category of a Navi. The Netziv concludes by saying, the Avraham Hayan Navi ba'ofen harishon levad. Avraham was a Navi. It's true. Hashem did speak to Avraham. But the category of prophecy that Hashem blessed Avraham with was category number one, according to the Netziv. His was the type of prophecy that was focused on the present, an issue. And that did not necessarily explain the hiddenness that Rivka was searching for. Whatever was going on within her is not something that Abraham would have been able to understand, because that's not the type of communication that Hashem established with Abraham. And there, because of this, says the Netziv, Halchala Adam Gadol, to shame. Because she understood that he saw things that Abraham didn't or wouldn't. It's an interesting idea. And for a couple of points here that I thought just I want to reflect with you about. that Shem somehow, although he too, like Abraham, was considered to be some sort of prophet, there are different types of prophecies. And that just because one person's a prophet and the other person's a prophet doesn't mean that they both have the same capabilities and abilities or insights. So what the Netziv is saying is Shem had something or an awareness that Abraham didn't. So for example, not even an example, one way of understanding it is Shem was a refugee from the flood. He was a refugee of the Mabul because he was one of Noah's kids. So what did that experience provide him? Not just as a human experience, but what messages did Hashem teach him, either directly or indirectly? So when Shem got off of the Teva and then began to grow his family, apparently he was given Ruach HaKodesh to understand things that Abraham, as great as Abraham was, and he was amazing, I mean, he was the first Kiviyachol, the first Jew. He was Avraham Ivri, the Avraham the Hebrew. We're called Hebrews because Abraham was the first of the Hebrews. But Shem, in some ways, who predated Abraham, had things that Abraham didn't. And so it just made me think a little bit about who are our mentors? Who are the people in your lives that you would go to seek guidance and counseling? Like when something comes in our lives that is difficult for us to sort of figure out, who helps us with that? Clearly, hopefully, there's somebody whom we love in our lives. It could be a spouse, it could be a parent, whoever, sibling, it could be a friend. But one of the things that this pasuk is definitely saying to us is that there ought to be people in our lives who are our spiritual mentors. That's different from the family mentor. And the family mentor will be able to tell us things which are appropriate within the configuration of family dynamics. Sometimes they'll be able to offer us even deeper insights. But there ought to be people that are worthy of trust and our confidence because they have some sort of spiritual sensitivity. Not everybody has it. I'm not sure that I'm that person for everybody. I have people in my life that I would go to and ask for certain types of advice because I think they have a spiritual sensitivity. And those things don't often happen. I think you have to cultivate that. You have to build that trust. You have to begin that relationship. But the second point of that is that it does mean that those are relationships that we should be considering building. And it's a fascinating thing how that happens. And I'm not going to be naive enough to say that, okay, every rabbi should be trusted in the same way. I get that. There's too many stories, there's too many news reports, unfortunately, that prove that you need to be very cautious and critical and use your good judgment in deciding whom you're going to trust. I understand that. But the point behind that I'm trying to make is that the notion of spiritual mentors and people with spiritual insight to go to seek some sort of spiritual advice about some sort of life event, maybe something worth considering. I think that's one of the messages that the Netziv is sharing with us. So let's go a little bit further in this story. One of the parts of the story that happened in chapter 25, shortly after the story, is the famous story of Yaakov and Esau. So we know that the children are born, twins, but at some point they begin to diverge. According to the Midrash, it happened when they became about bar mitzvah, that they seem to be identical, not only in physical appearance, but also in their behavior, until they became of age, Vayigidalu ha'na'arim. And it's that point that I guess each one had their own personalities, and they started veering off into different directions. Yaakov, as described by the Torah, Ishtam Yoshev Olim, he represents, I guess, the person who pursued a spiritual existence, was more tent-bound, study-bound, spiritual growth-bound, whereas Esau was a man of the field. He represents, I guess, an embrace of the physicality of our lives. He was a hunter. He was prepared to take a lot of risks, physical as well as other risks. So the boys diverged. And not only did they diverge in interests, as the Chachamim tell us, the Midrash seems to indicate, these interests also marked a difference in the type of people they became. Yaakov was more refined, was more in tune with the spiritual, whereas Esav, in pursuit of the physical pleasures, began to slowly diminish his embrace of those things which were spiritual, which of course was his father's message. So this is the story as it's described. Vayazid, I'm reading now chapter 25, pasuk 29. Vayazid Yaakov Nazid, vayavo Esav min hasedeh v'oyev. So the day came upon, that Yaakov is simmering a stew, and Esav came in from the field, and he was exhausted. Vayomer Esav el Yaakov, and Esav said to Yaakov, pour into me now some of that very red stuff, for I am exhausted. He therefore called his name Edom. Aliteni na min ha'adom hazeh. So there's Yaakov, and he seems to be cooking up a stew, some sort of big soup or stew. In comes, or from the field emerges Esav, famished, tired, and he turns to his brother and says, "You know what? I'm so hungry. How about I open up my mouth and you take a ladle and just pour the soup into me? I'm so hard. I don't even have time for it to wash. I don't have time for even to use any cutlery." So that's the image. So there's an interesting Rashi here that I want to share with you. And the Rashi tries to explain, like, there's details here, right? The detail meaning like what type of soup it was, and then he was cooking soup. What seems to be what ought to have been the key part of the story is the transaction. So what was it, whether you're eating soup or roasting, making a barbecue, like what's the difference what Yaakov is doing? But apparently the Torah wants us to understand this specific point. It was a stew, and it had a red color to it. So once the Torah pauses to give us a little bit more detail, Rashi quotes a midrash. You probably know that. And it says this, Ubishel Yaakov Adashim, that stew was a lentil soup. And of course, they're different colored lentils, but since the Torah tells us it was the color of this stew was red, it was red lentils. Lahavrot et ha'avel. But Rashi goes one step further and says, well, he wasn't just stum. It didn't happen to be that he was cooking lentil soup. There was a reason he was cooking lentil soup. And what was the reason? And Rashi says, because that was the day that Avram Avinu died. Avram was alive, as we mentioned at the beginning of the Parsha, but he died. So if Avram dies, Yitzchak now is a mourner. And Yaakov is now cooking stew, and Rashi uses the phrase lahavrot et ha'avel. Lahavrot means to prepare food for, but literally means to, as it were, to heal, to give strength to the mourner. And one more, just a little bit more in Rashi, the lama adashim, of all the things, why was it lentils? What was the significance of it being lentil soup? And Rashi answers based on Midrash, shudamot legalgal, because lentils are small, but they're round. The shape is significant here. The shape of the lentil is what we need to think about. Why? Shehavelut galgal chozer ba'olam, because in some ways mourning is like a galgal, is a wheel, a circular pattern that returns over and over and over again. So what's going on here? There are a couple points that this midrash is mentioning. So the first thing that we mentioned was lahavrot et ha'avel. Now there's a halacha that probably many of you know, but this, according to many, is the source of that halacha. This Rashi, this whole episode between Esav and Yaakov. What's the halacha? The halacha is that after the cemetery, after the burial for a relative is done, the family, the seven mourners, meaning, remember that according to the Torah, one is thrust into a period of mourning if one of the following relations passes away: husband, wife, father, mother, sister, brother, spouse, or child, God forbid, God forbid. So if any of those pass away, the mourners now come back from the cemetery, and when they come into the house after doing the washing, the friends are obligated to give the mourner what's called in Hebrew Seudat havra'ah, the meal of recovery. Hopefully you've all heard of that, the meal of recovery. And one of the halachot about that meal, by the way, is that it can't be with the Avel's own food, meaning the Avel should not prepare for himself. So you're not going into the kitchen before, the funeral's at 11. I'm going to just prepare for myself. So when I come home, the food will be ready. That's not what we do. Other people, other than the mourners, can be a family member, but not the mourners, prepare the meal. And what is this meal that we're talking about? And the meal, at least now, the custom now is that it includes two things. One is lechem, and the other is beitza, is an egg. So the egg, one of the reasons that we use an egg is because of this Rashi. And Rashi says that the food or the soup that Yaakov was cooking was adashim, lentils, because the shape itself becomes symbolic, a symbolic expression of the mental state of the Avel. And what is the mental state of the Avel? Ein lo peh, she'asur l'daber. Meaning that the shape of the lentil is round, and when you think of as something round, so where's the top, where's the bottom? Well, there is no top, there is no bottom. That's the point of something round. Something that's rectangular, something that has a line, linear, well, you can sort of designate start, finish, middle, top, but not when something is round, similar to an egg. You can't say where's the top of the egg, where's the bottom of the egg. The egg has that sort of elliptical shape, similar to something gull, that roundness. And the idea is that when a person is really truly thrust into mourning, there's a state of disorientation that goes on. And there's a lack of attention to so many things. And that lack of attention, that lack of orientation, that being just unable to focus, that's symbolically expressed by the shape of the lentil in the soup or the shape of the egg that we give to the mourner. And that's one of the reasons that when the Avel comes back, we give them those things specifically. But what's the reason behind the whole Sudat Havra'ah? One of the reasons behind the Sudat Havra'ah, and I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, maybe Chas v'shalom experienced it yourself, is that when a person is thrust into mourning, so many other things that would normally be part of our conscious life just go completely out of our minds. We don't care about them. We're not aware of them. We pay no attention to them. They don't bother us. We're not even aware of what's happening to ourselves physiologically, like hunger, which might have been something that people feel when, God forbid, you're thrust into avelut. You're not thinking about eating. You're not thinking about drinking, not at all. And a mourner may choose not to eat or drink even because what they want to do is, in a sort of inexplicable way, subconscious way, they want to identify themselves with the person who passed away. And the person who passed away is no longer engaged in those human activities. So the mourner, expressing their closeness to, somehow want to be more like their beloved person who passed away. So they don't want to eat. But we, the rest of the community, we understand that that's not the way in which we want the path to be followed. Yes, we understand about mourning, and yes, we understand about the loss, but we also understand that it's the mourner's responsibility to mourn, but not to give in to these dark desires to end their own life out of grief. And so it's incumbent upon the rest of the community to embrace them warmly and encourage them and say, you don't have to eat a big meal, but we're going to start the meal process. We're going to start the care process to make sure that during Shiva, that the mourners begin slowly trying to deal with their grief in a way which is healthy, both psychologically as well as physiologically, physically. So this halakha teaches us the responsibility that we have towards our friends, our family, our colleagues, our peers in distress. So when an individual feels alone or feels hurt, then the rest of us around that person or persons must rise and give them the emotional support that they need. And so, if nothing else, then the sort of idea, this institution, this halakha that was established about Sudat Havra'ah, helps the mourner realize that she or he is never really alone. And has that the rest of the community has their back, and the goodwill that exists is in some ways a comfort. It's not that eating is the point. The point is the reintegration into the healing process. Eating is a part of it. They don't have to sit down and give them the biggest meal, but this halacha is often traced back to this story where Yaakov is cooking because Abraham passed away. Yitzchak then enters in a period of mourning, and Yaakov wants to cook something, and he's cooking something because of the shape is significant. Galgal hachozer ba'olam. Life just keeps going. Someone is born, someone passes away, and someone is born again. So it's like this circle. And that, while now we find ourselves in a moment of mourning, it doesn't stay that way. I don't know exactly how long that takes everybody, and I've said to a lot of different people, there is no schedule for mourning. There is no schedule. There's no, okay, by this point you should be feeling this way, and these many months after the person was buried, you should be feeling that way. That's not the way it works, and we understand that. But in the big picture of life, everything's going like this all the time, birth and passing and birth again. Okay, let's go on a little bit more. So Yaakov and Esau are twins, and they're very different. And there's always been a question that the Mefarshim try to deal with was the difference between them something that was noticeable? Well, certainly it was noticeable to Rivka, but was it noticeable to Yitzchak? Torah tells us that there seemed to be difference in the relationships that the parents had to their sons. It does say that Yitzchak loved his son, Esau, but Rivka had a special connection to Yaakov. Doesn't mean that they didn't love the other kids, but there is something special. Yitzchak had a special relationship with Esau, and Rivka had a special relationship with Yaakov. The Mishnah in Masechet Avot suggests that there is something more wholesome about Rivka's love for Yaakov. It wasn't based on anything specific. It wasn't ahava shetluya badavar. It wasn't a love that was dependent on any one thing. She just had this overwhelming love for Yaakov because of the type of person he was. But Torah says that Yitzchak, Yitzchak and Esau, that he loved him. And our Chachamim understood that there seemed to be more of a reason for Yitzchak to love Esau, maybe because of what Esau did for Yitzchak. And one of the things that Esau did brilliantly, much to the concern of his brother Yaakov, Esau really did respect his father, and was known. He had developed a reputation of being very close to Yitzchak and caring deeply for him. And so maybe that was Yitzchak's reciprocation, that he felt this about Esau, and that's why he reciprocated. But be that as it may, something happens. Yitzchak, has a realization that the end of his life is drawing to a close. And so the Torah tells us in chapter 27, Vayehi zaken Yitzchak, and it came to pass when Yitzchak had become old, Vatichena inav meirot, and his eyes dimmed from seeing. Vaikrat Esav beno hagadol, and he summoned Esav, his older son, and he said to him, Bini v'yomer elav hinen. He said to my son, and he said to him, Esav said, here I am. And Yaakov and Yitzchak said to Esav, see now I have aged. I know not the day of my death. Now sharpen, if you please, your gear, your sword, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then make me delicacies such as I love, and bring it to me, and I will eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die. So this is a very difficult moment, I think, in the Parsha. It's a difficult moment because we see Yitzchak and Rivka acting in very different ways, and they're not communicating with each other. Rivka hears this conversation taking place between Esav and his father, and Rivka responds by realizing that Yitzchak's, or not realizing, thinking that Yitzchak's intention are going to have terrible, terrible results. And so, as you know the story, she quickly calls over Yaakov, and she tells Yaakov to quickly do as she tells him to do, to dress up like Esav. She gives Yaakov Esav's spiritual clothing, the clothing that he wore when he would be serving in his capacity as a religious representative of the family, which he did not like doing. So these clothes were not resting in Yaakov's tent. Mom had them. And she sets up this moment where Yitzchak, apparently blind as he is, unaware of what's going on around him visually, and Rivka takes advantage of that and pushes Yaakov into the tent and says, you go, listen to what I'm telling you. You need to be the one that Yitzchak blesses. Now, were Rivka and Yitzchak on the same page here? It's an interesting question. At the end of last week's Parsha, when Rivka and Yitzchak met for the first time, the Netziv, Naphtali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, whose one opinion I share with you, said something very, very profound. So if you take a look at that moment where Rivka and Yitzchak meet for the very first time, the Torah tells us the following. Batisa Rivka etenaha, so she's coming back with Eliezer. She's riding on a camel, and she sees this man in the field from a distance. And she sees Yitzchak, and she comes off of her camel. Vatomer el Eved, so she turns to Eliezer, the Eved, and she asks, Mi aish who's that person who's walking towards us in our direction? Because she's never seen him before. And Eliezer answers, oh, he's my master, who Adoni. So she takes this shawl, sa'if, and she covers herself up. So that's the verse. She takes the shawl and she covers herself up. And Naphtali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin explains that description in the Torah, again, descriptions are usually portals of meaning. And when you see a description, what does it add to the story? Is it important how she's dressed when the two of them meet? Well, if the Torah wants to tell us that she covered herself up, that's an important detail. Why it's important is for us to uncover. So Naphtali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin says there is a symbolic meaning behind that. What's the symbolic meaning? So when you cover yourself up, you're hiding yourself to a certain extent. You're literally covering your face. But if you're covering your face, what you're also doing is you're creating a barrier between you and whoever stands at the other side of that veil or shawl. In this case, it was between Rivka and Yitzchak. And then it sees that description as being symbolic of the way in which their relationship developed over time. And the most bold description of that distance or lack of closeness is our story in this week's Parsha of the bracha to Yitzchak, from Yitzchak to Esav, Yitzchak to Yaakov. Had Rivka gone over to Yitzchak and said, you can't do this. You need to know what's going on here. It can't be this way. It can't be that way. It can only be this way. Maybe he and she, Rivka and Yitzchak, could have had a conversation and a lot of anger might have been avoided, but she doesn't. And it could be a suggestion based on the Netziv's end of Parsha explanation that there was something about the relationship. Now, I would not have had the chutzpah to say something like this if it weren't for some of the Gedolim before me. Who am I to tell you the nature of the relationship between Yitzchak and Rivka? My goodness. But one of the things is that. And you wonder, Rav Shimshon Rafal Hirsch, in another comment in this week's Parsha, said something so I don't know, so critical. I've said this before in other shiurim, but it becomes, I think, yet another example of the nature of the relationship between Yitzchak and Rivka, which seemed to be different than the relationship between Avram and Sarah. What was the comment that Shimshon Rafal first says? So Torah says, "Vayigdalu hana'arim." I mentioned before that the two boys grew up, but their paths diverged, and they diverged to become these two prototypes of two very different types of people, almost people who ultimately never can be reconciled, and they have a very, very adversarial relationship, not just between the two of them, but they become actually progenitors of the adversarial relationship always between Yaakov's of the world, the descendants of Yaakov, and the descendants of Esau. But what Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says is pretty bold. What does he say? He says they're twins. So, you've all seen stories about twins on TV or watched them on whatever, of how close they are, how they finish each other's sentences. Sometimes you have stories about twins who are separated at birth or given up for adoption, but things happen and they haven't ever met each other, and they're so similar in different ways. They have same likes, they dress the same, they do the same things, same pastimes. Like, these stories are sort of amazing to think about, how two twins separated at birth can still have so many things in common, like we're drawn together. And yet in our story, not. So Hirsch says that was Yitzchak and Rivka's fault. What do you mean it was fault? And Hirsch boldly claims, and I say the word boldly with great respect for Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, great respect, that they tried to put a square peg in a round hole, that they had two kids who had different inclinations. Yitzchak and Rivka saw that Yaakov was a studious young man, and he loved to read, he loved to learn, he loved to philosophize, he loved to use his intellect. But not all boys are like that. Not all kids in school have the same interests. There are some kids who would much rather be playing soccer outside in the playground than reading a book. And so Asaph was that kid. Asaph was that kid who liked to play. He liked to be out there. He was a kinesthetic learner. He liked to move around and stuff. Whereas Yaakov, he's that kid who never shouts, never screams, never does anything wrong, never bullies anybody. He's the teacher's perfect kid in class, right? Everybody said, "Oh, Yaakov, oh, he's such a great kid." Asaph, on the other hand, and you've probably seen this or read about these sorts of stories. And so Rivka and Yitzchak try to treat Esau in the same manner that they raised Yaakov. That was a mistake. That was a mistake. And was it a mistake because they didn't see it? Was it a mistake because they just weren't on the same page, mom and dad? We're not talking. I don't know. Is that possibly one of the next examples of how covering her face with a veil, as Netziv said, is more symbolic than we may originally have thought? Maybe in the Middle East that was the proper way, and we didn't think about interpreting it other than maybe Rivka was just behaving in a culturally appropriate manner when she came to see a man that she didn't know yet, even if she was ultimately his wife, possibly. But then it seems saw deeper, and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch also sees it in that way. And the other part about how they raise their children, they raise them so differently, comes up in other parts of this as well. So in a part of the story that I think I glossed over a little too quickly, and I'm going to just go back for 1 second because I want to say this idea, share it with you because I think it's important. Excuse me. When Yaakov was entering into this transaction with his brother to acquire the birthright, and when he was so thirsty and hungry and give me the red lentil soup, okay. So Yaakov says, "I'll give it to you. I want the birthright. I want your birthright." And Torah tells us that was not something that seemed to be really not that important to Esav at all. So the word here, the way in which Esav answers this request is this. I'll read it in Hebrew then English. Vayomer Esav, after having been told by Yaakov, "Here, I'll give you the soup. I'll get it. I just want the birthright. I want us to I want you to sell it. I want you to give it to me, sell it to me, make it mine. Well, Yomar Esav hears this request. Listen, I'm going to go die, says Esav to his brother Yaakov. I'm going to be dying. Velama ze li bechora. Velama ze li bechora. And what use to me is a birthright? Velama ze li bechora. Like, what am I going to do with it? So why did he think he was going to die? Like, was he sick or something? A lot of difference of opinions here. Some say that he was a hunter. So there's a lot of danger involved in hunting, especially in those times. It was ancient times. You're using a spear and a bow and arrow, whatever it is. So you're really coming in close contact with the wild animals that you're killing. So Asaph understood that what he was dedicating his life to had an element of danger. So he says, I don't really need this. But the word that the Chachamim, at least the Midrash, focuses on is zeh. V'lama zeh li b'chora. Could have said v'lama li b'chora. I don't need the b'chora. But Asaph inserts the word zeh. So does zeh have any language, any significance? And so the Midrash says, maybe yes. What would the significance be? The significance, says the Gemara Masechet Bava Batra, and Gemara comments and makes a very interesting comparison. It says, the word zeh in this pasuk, lama zeh li bechora, why do I need the birthright? Reminds me, says the Gemara, of another time where the word zeh plays an important role, but it has nothing to do with Esav and Yitzchak and Rivka and Yaakov. It's when Bnei Yisrael successfully cross over the Yam Suf and Moshe leads them in Shivat Hayam. And he said, saying, Zeh Keli v'anveyu. This is my God, and I will beautify him. I will glorify him. Zeh Keli v'anveyu. And so when Esav declares Lama Zeh, it's as though, maintains the Gemara, what he's really doing is not just making a statement, I don't need it. He says, I don't need what it represents. It's not just, I don't need the birthright. I don't need the whole package that comes with the birthright. Zeh Keli v'anvehu, the word Zeh is like that opening up of a great understanding about God's role in the world. This is my God. Look what God has done for me. Look at the Yam Suf. Look at the Egyptians drowning. Look at all of this. Look at God's presence in the world. Look at how God has saved the Jews. Look at our redemption. So the word Zeh in that verse, according to this Gemara, is so laden with so much richness of faith and certainty that God protects us. Whereas Asaph says, you know what, I don't trust in any of this. I don't feel that way. I don't need it. I don't feel that love of God. I don't have a love of God. I don't need the zeh in my life. This is not necessary in my life. So it's as though Asaph is rejecting a fundamental aspect of belief. Again, is that because they pushed him into the wrong corner by not raising him properly? So this whole family dynamic in this Parsha is one of a lot of, it's difficult. It's difficult. And I think that truthfully, there's probably many families in our community and certainly many communities throughout the world, throughout history, where it's not always so easy, is it? Like raising kids is not easy. It's just not easy. And we never want to raise kids who are just replicas of ourselves. That's not the goal. We want to raise kids who are thinking, they're critical, and bring their personality, their energy, their talents, their insights, who they are to the world. But they can only get to do that if somehow we create the environment that makes it possible for that part of them to be embraced, welcomed, acknowledged, and encouraged. So Hirsch was pretty strong and said, maybe that's not what Yitzchak and Rivka did, or at least they didn't do it the right way. And so you end up raising a kid who says, Zeh, I'm not that, I will not be a Zeh Keli v'anvehu Jew. I'm going to be Lama Zeli. I don't need this. When Bnei Israel said Zeh Keli v'anvehu, they were making a pretty clear statement of optimism. The future is bright, the future is good, we're confident, resolute. We have a reason to be happy, a reason to be joyful, a reason to be grateful, even when things look hard. But Asap's life was not easy, apparently, and we may feel, or others may feel like, I'm dying. anochi holechem. I'm on the way out. I'm on the way to die. There's just too much pressure, too much sadness, too much challenge. And probably think that there's a lot of people in the world today who may be saying that because circumstances look that way. But the Esav that is described in the Parsha is not the Esav that we want our children to be. We want our children to be optimistic, even when things are difficult. I want to share one of the most, I shared this before, but in some ways it's so true. It's so true, and somehow it rings even more true now than it ever did in Jewish history. Yaakov understands when his mother dresses him up that he's about to do something that's of historic proportion. He's about to do something that probably runs very deeply against the grain of his own personality. He's about to deceive his father. He knows his father is blind. His mother, whom he loves, and he has a very close connection, is pushing him to go into the father's tent and to fake that he's Esav in order to get Yitzchak to give him the bracha that the Bechor should have. This is all predicated on Rivka's belief that whatever it is Yitzchak is going to give, thinking that it's Esav, it's going to be something special that she doesn't want Yaakov to lose out on. Is that really what happened? That's a good question. But in the meantime, Yaakov doesn't want to do it. And so Rivka has to come up with some sort of statement that's going to push him to do something that she knows he doesn't want to do. And so Yaakov says, listen, if my father discovers who I am, he's gonna curse me out. Like, what do you think is gonna happen? I will be in such disfavor of my father. It's too disrespectful. I don't want to do this. To which Rivka says, Alai kilalatcha b'ni. Literally, it means your curse will be on me, my son. What do you mean your curse? Rivka says, look, if Abba finds out, if Yitzhak finds out what has happened and he's angry and there's a curse, I will bear the curse, says Rivka. I will be the one to bear all the consequences of what has happened. Alai kilalatcha, on me, your curse, kilalatcha klala shalcha, my son. That's for sure the pshat. That's for sure the simple meaning. The Vilna Gaon says that what Rivka said to Yaakov here, Alai kilalatcha b'ni, is much deeper than simply I will be the one to bear the burden. What she was really saying is a prophetic message to all Jews, to all generations, to all of Yaakov's descendants. And the Vilna Gaon says that the word Alai, on me, is made up of three letters. It's an ayin, a lamed, and a yud. Alai kilalatcha b'ni. Your curse will be on me. Vilna Gaon says the word Alai should not be understood to mean on me. The word Alai, says the Vilna Gaon, is actually an acronym. That each of the three letters is the first letter of three separate words. And what Rivka is saying is, Yaakov, I know that you think that what will happen is you'll just deal with Yitzchak's anger. But she says prophetically, Yaakov, listen, your klala is the klala of Alai, Ayin Lamed Yud, which is Ayin is the first letter of the name Esav. Your curse will be Esav, not Yaakov. What is Esav? Esav historically has always represented that force which seeks the physical annihilation of the Jewish people. So Rivka is telling Yaakov, the curse that you will be dealing with for all ages will be the curse of our enemies who wish to destroy the Jewish people. How true that is. The curse of Esav. That's the ayin. And what's the lamed? According to the Vilna Gaon, Rivka is telling Yaakov the curse of Alai, Esav, the lamed is Lavan. Lavan, you know the story of Lavan, of course. This was the story of when Yaakov ends up in the house of Lavan, and Lavan and he at some point don't get along. But what does Lavan represent? Why is Lavan such an enemy to the Jewish people? As the Vilna Gaon understands it, and as Chazal generally understand it, Lavan's force was the force of assimilation, the force that says, you be more like us. We don't want to kill you, but we don't want you to be who you are. We don't want you to be Jewish anymore. We want you to be more like us. Lavan wanted Yaakov not to be who he was. He didn't want Yaakov's spiritual direction to be what it was. He wanted Yaakov to give all of that up. And so, according to the Vilna Gaon, that is what Rivka is telling Yaakov. Your curse, Yaakov, is going to be the curse of having to fight the tendencies and the forces of assimilation throughout Jewish history. And no time has it ever been greater than I think than it is right now. Well, maybe in the time of Hanukkah, by the way, it might have been great. It was great. But it is really great now, and I've said this before as a part of the research from the Pew study, I don't know how many years ago, when out of every 10 marriages in the United States that involve Jews, out of every 10 marriages involving Jews, 7 are intermarriages. 7 out of 10. So when we talk about the curse of Lavan, we are living at the time of the curse of Lavan. And the Yud of Alai, that's the third curse that Rivka says, Yaakov, that will be what you and your descendants will have to deal with for throughout history. The Yud is the first letter of the name Yosef. And what's Yosef? Like, what's the curse? The curse of Yosef is the curse of Jews hating Jews. Jews fighting against Jews, Jews screaming at Jews, Jews cursing other Jews, Jews labeling other Jews, Jews excluding other Jews, Jews beating up other Jews. And so, last summer before October 7th, it got to such a fevered pitch in Israel, as we all know. That was the Yosef curse. That was the curse of Jews turning to each other and screaming terrible, terrible things, the division. And that, of course, would fracture the family. Yosef's family was fractured. And I don't think it ever really became healed again, even out of Yom Hazeh. Meaning that when that whole story happened, as it will be described in a few weeks in Sefer Breshit, it broke the Jewish people. It created a rift between the children of Leah, the children of Rachel, not really ever fully reconciling between the two sides of the family. And so those are the 3 curses, Esav, Lavan, and Yosef. And when Yaakov didn't want to go into the tent, Rivka, in a moment of prophetic insight, says to him, this is Kinderspiel. What you think may happen if your father finds out is going to be worse than you even imagine, because it's not going to be just about him. It's going to be on a much grander scale. The story, I'll just end with an interesting explanation. So, of course, at the end of the Parsha, when Yitzchak does give Yaakov the blessing, Esav discovers what happened. The Torah tells us that Esav makes a decision that he's going to murder his brother because he felt he's been duped, he's been deceived, not incorrectly. So Rivka is concerned that she is going to see the demise of both her sons, because who knows how this is going to end. So she goes to Yitzchak and tells Yitzchak that for the sake of finding a shidduch for Yaakov, he should leave home and go back home where she lived to Padan Aram. Maybe Yaakov will find a wife there, just like Yitzchak found Rivka also there. So it made sense to Yitzchak, and Yitzchak agrees to it. And here's a fascinating thing at the very end of the Parsha. So before Yaakov leaves on his journey back to find a wife, ostensibly that's the explicit reason, but we know that the real motive for sending Yaakov away was to avoid him getting killed by his brother. It was Rivka's wish and hope that there would be some sort of reconciliation and that he would come home and that Rivka would once again be reunited with her son. That was never to be the case. Rivka dies and never sees Yaakov again. When he leaves at the end of this Parsha, the beginning of next week's Parsha, she never sees him again. But here's what happens. Before he leaves home, he goes to his father, Yitzchak, and Yitzchak gives him a bracha. And this is what the bracha says. I'll read it in English to save time, because it's a little bit late. So I'm reading now from Perek Chavchet 28, Pasuk Gimel. Listen to the words. And may Kel Shakai bless you, make you fruitful, and make you numerous, and make you a congregation of peoples. May he grant you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may possess the land of your sojourns, which God gave to Abraham. He never said that to Esau. When you take a look through the Parsha, I'm not going to read it. When Yitzchak gave the bracha to whom he thought was Esau, is really Yaakov, he never mentioned this idea of Avraham, that you should somehow be an inheritor of Avraham. He never mentions it at all. But now, knowing that Yaakov is Yaakov, and before Yaakov leaves, this is what Yitzchak says to Yaakov explicitly, in full awareness of who he's giving the bracha to. Which means, did Yitzchak not know? Did Rivka not get it? Yitzchak never intended to give that spiritual bracha to be the inheritor of Abraham. He never gave that bracha to Esau. He never intended to. Because when he gave the bracha to Yaakov, thinking it was Esau, he never mentioned this. So he was always keeping that in his back pocket. It was almost as though he was always intending to give it to the right kid, which was Yaakov. So did Rivka and Yitzchak, they didn't see eye to eye, they never spoke about this, but at the very end, he gives this bracha to Yaakov, knowing it's Yaakov, knowing that he's leaving. So again, did he or did he not know? Was Yitzchak really fooled, or did he know exactly what he was dealing with and gave the right bracha to the right person? But at the very end, Yitzchak and Rivka have no choice but to say goodbye to Yaakov, who leaves on the road to find his fortune, his future, his wife, his destiny in another place. So here's when Yaakov leaves home in next week's Parsha, he leaves empty-handed. That's made very clear. He leaves empty-handed. He has nothing. He has no money. He leaves without anything. Now, why is that? If you're sending your kid, like you send your kid to camp, okay, you give them care packages. Here's a couple of extra bucks. Buy yourself something at camp when you go to the tuck or whatever that thing is called, whatever it is. Make sure you have some money. Yitzchak and Rivka give nothing to Yaakov. He leaves empty-handed. He leaves really with nothing. That's what we understand next week's Parsha. Why is that? Why is that? So some of the Forshim say something fascinating. They say Yitzchak was broke. Yitzchak had no money at this point. That while we may be thinking that Yitzchak is very wealthy, the truth is that hasn't happened. Yitzchak is not a wealthy man. He has nothing to give to Yaakov. And according to the Ibn Ezra, Yitzchak lost all his money left to him by Abraham, and he was now impoverished. He was broke. And later, when Yitzchak migrates to Gerar, he once again builds up there a pretty big fortune. And as a proof of them being broke, Yitzchak points to, Ibn Ezra points to Yitzchak's request in the earlier on in this parsha to bring him food before receiving the bracha. Why would Yitzchak need his son to bring him dinner? Like, why does Yitzchak ask Esau, go cook me something? So according to Ibn Ezra says, because Yitzchak had no means by which to support himself. What an interesting take on this. It's just so inconsistent with the picture that all the Meforshim draw. But Ibn Ezra we see is a bold guy. He's not afraid to say things that he thinks, even though other people think he's so off base. And if Yitzchak and Rivka had money, certainly they would not have allowed their son to leave home empty-handed. So therefore, Ibn Ezra maintains that the family had no money, and the inheritance privileges, therefore, were of no interest to anybody. That's one of the reasons I think Esau was so quick to say, you want the Bechorah, take the Bechorah. Because one of the big benefits of being the Bechor was you had double portion of the inheritance. So 0 times 2 or 2 times 0 is still 0. So Esau figured, what do I need the status for? I have no privilege that comes with that. I won't inherit anything because mom and dad are busted. They're broke. They've got no money. But many of the Meforshim, including the Rambam, believe this is absolutely not the case. But it does show that the stories of Yitzhak and Rivka are so nuanced. And that when we read these parshas, and we all know these stories growing up and learning them, sometimes we read them and we know what we learned when we were younger, and sometimes we fail to sort of just stop and take a one layer off and say, let's dig a little bit deeper into these stories and see what's behind them. But there's so much behind them. And again, they're not just about two people who lived centuries ago. They're also about the challenges of families, the challenges of personal relationships, the challenges of finding mentors, the challenges of communication, which often really lie at the heart of any positive relationship. The challenge of raising children, the challenges of being a parent, the challenges of being a spouse, the challenges of believing in God, challenges of doing the right thing, and doing the right thing when things seem to be getting tough. Zekeli and Lamazet Bechorah. Anyways, that's why these parashot, I think, are so beloved to the Jewish people, because they speak in terms that all of us understand. Because one way or the other, these are stories about the same journeys we have in our lives. But it's the same way that Hashem accompanied our Avot on their journey. Yiratzon, may Hashem always accompany us on our journey. And may the journey of this coming week be a journey again of bracha and simcha, release of the hostages. May we see Shalom Yisrael. May we see Jews loving each other. And may we welcome the Mashiach. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Marika, for your sponsorship.
Thank you, Rabbi Diamond. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Happy to, let's see if we can. What do we have to do?
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'm so glad that you joined. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Let's go over here, the gallery view.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. Tito, happy to see you. Tina, hi. Hi, Leora. Hi, Linda. Hi, Ruth. Hi, Harold again. So, anything we said in this week's Parsha of interest to anybody?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
I ask a
Speak to the
question.
heart.
Yeah.
The yeshiva of Shem and Ava
Yeah.
comes up twice in the commentary.
Yeah.
Where did it come from? I mean, it seems to come out of nowhere. And what did it do? They have only 2 students. What did they teach?
That's a really good question, Marty. So what did they teach? I remember reading a fascinating explanation from Yaakov Kamenetsky, the late Rosh Hashiva Torah V'dat, in his collection of ideas in his sefer called Emet Yaakov. And at the very beginning of next week's Parsha, Meforshim mentioned that from the time that Yaakov left his parents' house, which is referred to at the end of this week's Parsha and starts next week's Parsha, till he got to where he needed to go to find a wife, was 14 years.
Yep.
So 14 years, like, what's that about? So as you said, the Meforshim say, our oral tradition tells us that he went to the Shiur of Shem Ava. So Rabbi Kamenetsky says something fascinating. He says, well, his father is Yitzchak. His grandfather was Abraham. So what is it that he needed to go to the yeshiva of Shem for Aver that he couldn't have picked up at home? And Rabbi Kamenetsky, similar to one of my earlier comments at the beginning of this week's Parsha, says something fascinating. He says, different people teach Torah in different ways. And what happens in our lives definitely shapes the way we understand the world and the way in which we interpret things. And so Yaakov was going to be spending 20 years at the home of Lavan, who, as I mentioned before, becomes the quintessential a quintessential enemy of the Jewish people. In fact, at the Seder table, Arami Oved Aviv, and we openly declare that Lavan wanted to destroy the Jewish nation by destroying Yaakov. But Kamenetsky says, so what is it about the yeshiva of Shem ve'Aver that was specifically necessary for Yaakov to learn that he couldn't have learned at home? And he says this. He says, Shem and Aver, don't forget that if you take a look at their lifespan, not only did they span the time of the flood, but they also span the time of Dor HaFlagah, story of Migdal Bavel. So that was a story of making it through a period of time where the earth was populated by people, especially the story of the Mabul, who were violent against each other, and one tried to rebel against God. And so Rabbi Kamenetsky says, to be able to navigate your life while surrounded by being in a culture like that, you need somebody who's been in that culture to tell you how to do that. And that wasn't Yitzchak. Yitzchak could not possibly have prepared Yaakov in the way that he needed to be prepared to face the challenges of his own life. So when you ask, like, what do you learn in Shiur Shem ve'Aver? Well, obviously you're not learning Hilchos Rambam, and you're not learning, Perish Rashi, but you are learning about aspects of the existence of God, good and evil, the sort of philosophic understanding that people apparently were studying, or Shane was teaching. I can't say that there were many students, but those were things that were still part of the human experience. Like Abraham somehow came to understand some of these things through his own personal investigations. So it seems that Shem became, and Aver became those types of prophets or leaders and thought leaders that were able to teach ideas about God and his existence and how to lead lives that were in those times considered ethical. And that's not something that Yitzhak knew a lot about. So it suggests, at least, and I think fascinating, that there's some sort of difference between people's Torah, that the way in which they convey or understand things, and those differences are legit. And according to Rabbi Kamenetsky, that's what Yaakov needed to study in order to be able to manage his life.
If I,
And wonder whether or not that's also true for us. And then bring it down to a really, really micro level. We send, and I'm using a royal we, not anybody necessarily here, we send our kids off to college campuses because we want them to study certain things. But are we preparing our kids to deal with what they're going to have to deal with on those college campuses? So Rabbi Yaakov is suggesting that if Yaakov needed to spend 20 years of his life in Lavan's influence, he better be prepared. And I don't know whether or not we're preparing our kids to do some of that. Well, certainly we may not have, because we are startled by what we see worldwide now in college campuses. Nobody was prepared for that. But now that we see this, now that we watched it, now that it's transpired certainly all across North America, Canada, Europe. So what do we do now? What do we do now? I just think, I'm saying this parenthetically, I'm not as a political statement. I find that's going to be a really interesting question for those people who, really believe in the significance of college education and really think that our kids, boys and girls, need a college degree. So if we believe that, how do we make sure that our kids are prepared to go to college campuses? Is this going to change our attitudes at all? Are we going to reevaluate whether or not, sending our Yaakovs to a Lavan's house without being ready, is that or is that not the right thing to do?
I would just say that we call our words at, at a meeting about with some people who are thinking about some of those.
Master degrees, PhD, all right.
And I can tell you that some of the reactions that I heard at the meeting were very surprising and even troubling.
Well, okay. We'll have to hear more about it another time, Marty.
Yep, I will.
Okay. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us, and I really
Thank you.
appreciate
Good night,
you
Rabbi
joining and
Diamond.
listening.
Thank you.
I hope everybody has a wonderful week, and yes, then we'll see you next Tuesday night, 8 o'clock. Okay?
Thanks,
Tell
Rabbi.
your friends to come. It's not a secret. I'm happy to have as many people share our Torah as they can. Be well, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.